Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Politics and Governance here at the University of Texas. And we're glad that you're with us today for this forum with a panel of experts on the topic of technology versus the rule makers. We're interested at the center in exploring a number of issues in public policy related to innovation and the development of new technology and the challenge that that provides to public policy makers in general and regulators in particular. And I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome Adam Thierer here from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. If you go around the country to conferences and you talk with people like I do about these issues and you ask who's doing the most interesting work on them, Adam's is always the first name that people mention. So I'm really pleased that Adam made it, that you made it through the storm this morning on the plane. And what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to Adam so he can frame the day for us and talk a little bit about his work, and then he will introduce our panelists in succession as they do their presentations. So Adam, thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. It's very nice to be here. Welcome everybody to the event today on technology versus the rule makers, exploring the conflict between new inventions and regulations. I'm going to turn our panel over to our discussion over to our expert all-star panel in just a moment to discuss these issues. Before I do, I thought it might be helpful to actually frame a few of the important policy issues that we discuss a lot in the world of innovation and technology policy, not only in Washington, but in state capitals and international capitals these days, which may help frame the discussion that we're going to have here today with our panelists. These are just some of the sort of technologies and issues that we're frequently hearing discussed in the world of technology policy today. And in my department, in the technology policy department at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, these are our sort of top priority areas, if you will, sort of the future technology policy flashpoints that we spend a lot of time covering, writing law review and econ review articles about, working papers, even books, and trying to bring some focus on these issues that are making a lot of news. Most recently, I've published the second edition of a book on this topic, on these topics called Permissionless Innovation, the Continuing Case for Comprehensive Technological Freedom. And what I try to do in this book is to frame technology policy debates as sort of a clash of vision, if you will, clash of visions between this idea of permissionless innovation, or the general notion of the freedom to innovate without prior restraint, and the general freedom to innovate and even fail and take risks without that constraint, versus the idea of sort of a precautionary principle towards technological risk and innovation, or the crafting of public policies in such a way that new inventions aren't allowed until such time as their creators prove that they won't bring about any sort of risk or harm to society, to the economy, to culture, whatever else. And it's not a perfect way to sort of frame the paradigms that govern technology policy, but I think it crudely helps to think about it in these ways, because whenever you talk about any of these emerging technology issues that I just highlighted a moment ago, you always sort of see and hear these themes come out of, one viewpoint looks at innovation as something that needs to be carefully guided. The other thinks, no, it can be more freewheeling and open-ended. And the sort of precautionary principle mindset thinks about the need for bringing stability or equilibrium and in trying to anticipate risk before we move forward, whereas the permissionless innovation crowd is more about spontaneity and experimentation and adapting to risk as is needed. And this leads to a whole different set of policy solutions being proposed by these two different sort of schools of thinking about innovation, with the precautionary school thinking more about how we can come up with these sort of preemptive ex ante sort of top-down approaches to dealing with risk, versus the sort of more reactive after-the-fact ex post type of an approach. And so what you get are these sort of two different sort of set of solutions, with the precautionary approach taking more of a top-down approach of thinking about maybe prohibiting certain types of innovations, or limiting information, or licensing certain types of innovation. At a minimum, it's sort of regulatory oversight of these innovations, product guidance, defaults, so on and so forth, or maybe even just a form of sort of informal agency threats to sort of govern these things. Whereas the permissionless innovation crowd would say, no, let's take more of a bottom-up approach. Let's think about how we can educate people about risks, empower them with different tools, utilize maybe common law solutions or property and contract law solutions, or even other common law solutions like torts or product defects law. And then if all else fails, you come to sort of a very limited and targeted legal intervention to address technological risk. And so just in closing this sort of opening of mine, I try to put it all into sort of this one picture of, you know, precautionary principle mindset versus permissionless innovation that I talk about in the book, and thinking about sort of the range of options that policymakers might employ to try to deal with the range of technological risks out there. And it's important to note that we rarely are at either the very top or the very bottom of that spectrum. We're almost always somewhere in between. But generally in the academic literature and in sort of the battles about tech policy, people are generally framing it as a choice between sort of those two visions. And then what drives specifically the application of certain types of precautionary principle thinking? I divide it into 5 buckets in my work. I talk about policies that are being proposed to try to address either privacy on one hand, or safety, which could be a broad bucket of issues, security concerns, economic disruption, and then of course intellectual property. And so all of these emerging technologies that we see coming around today, whether we're talking about robots and autonomous vehicles, or driverless cars on one hand, or data-driven innovation like the Internet of Things, online advertising, advanced medical innovation, 3D printing, cryptography innovation, Bitcoin, blockchain innovation, VR, AR. I write papers on every one of these things. I have papers, and I'm constantly using sort of these sort of buckets and saying, okay, what are the specific policy threats that we see? And this is the whiteboard that hangs in my office at the Mercatus Center of how we sort of weight which of these technologies are likely to be affected by those specific concerns. And this is not a scientific weighting, to be sure. It's just an effort by my staff and I to try to address, okay, if you're doing robotics or you're doing Bitcoin, what do we think is going to be the driver of public policy in that area? And then the person, either internally or externally, who has the best skill set in sort of like dealing with, say, the privacy and security implications of the world of the Internet of Things, or the intellectual property concerns regarding 3D printing, or the tax considerations associated, or tax or labor issues associated with the sharing economy or Bitcoin. We then find people to help us, or we do them according to this sort of matrix. So that might just be a useful way to help frame these debates and think about these sort of conflict divisions between different worldviews or public policy paradigms, if you will, governing innovation policy. And maybe that'll help us frame the discussion here today. So let me introduce our all-star panel to discuss some of these issues. I'm just going to run down the line here and give you just a couple of lines about each of our presenters here today. Alan Blake is here with us. Alan, in 2001, co-founded Yorktown Technologies to commercialize GloFish, the world's first ever mass-marketed biotech animal. Because of the nature of the research involved in producing GloFish, Alan has extensive experience with regulators at the federal and state level. Welcome, Alan. Lara Jeremko, that's correct?
Lara Jeremko, yeah.
I'm sorry. Is the co-founder of Re3D, whose flagship technology, the Gigabot, enables industrial strength, large format 3D printing. She is also a partner at NextGen Venture Partners, a network of young startup investors. And Dima, hello again, Dima, is with us here today. I'm sorry, wait, we've been joined, are you Nicholas? Nicholson, I'm sorry. I didn't see you come in. Nicholson Price, Assistant Professor of Law at the University of New Hampshire. He was an academic fellow at Harvard Law School's, is it Petrie Flom Center? For Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics, and holds both a PhD and JD from Columbia University. And Dima and I work at the Mercatus Center together. She is a fellow as well at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and an assistant professor of economics at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. So I'm going to ask the panelists if they could come here and deliver the remarks at the podium with this microphone. This is our mic for the day. So I will leave it up here, and let's have Alan first. Sure.
All right. That's the first test. Can I get the technology to work? It's good being at a technology discussion. I'm glad I cleared that bar. So I'm actually in the biotechnology space, which you may have guessed doesn't really connect to some of this information technology. So I'm going to talk about GloFish as really a kind of a case study of biotechnology regulation. And then I'll talk a little bit more broadly about biotechnology and what can it do, why is this important, where are we going with this, both on the regulatory side and also on the practical side. My perspective on this, hello Monica, nice to see you. My perspective on this is that biotechnology will change the world and change our lives and change the nature of what it means to be human more than anything else that is out there today. And so I am really happy to be here and happy to have a chance to talk about this with you. So how many of you have heard of GloFish before? Anyone? Thank you. Great. Thank you. Good. So not bad. So GloFish is something that's been on the market now for about 12 years. And this was some text out of the New York Times now about not far from 15 years ago when GloFish first came out. So the idea was that GloFish represented, the release of GloFish into the market represented the start of the era of biotechnology. And whether or not ultimately historians will look back and see it that way or not, this certainly captures the feeling at the time when GloFish first hit the market. Just to put it in perspective, we got about 750 million media impressions. So that's the number of times someone would see, hear, or read about GloFish. It was on the front page of the New York Times, mutant in the pet shop, question mark. Yes, my parents loved that article in particular because it had all these columns about how the release of GloFish was, like the end of the world, the space-time continuum was going to be destroyed. It was the world would stop spinning, but Alan Blake, a failed .comer, dismisses all of these concerns. Yes, I had a little internet company before that. So anyway, so front page of the New York Times, LA Times, Good Morning America, ABC, CBS, virtually everywhere that you can think of from television, radio, or newspaper, GloFish was there domestically and internationally. So it was a big deal. And just to tell you a little bit about GloFish, it's a fluorescent fish. This now underpins a category of fish keeping that accounts for about 10% of all sales in the aquarium fish industry. So the fish and then all the associated dry goods, aquarium kits, plants, lights, etc. Available in about 8,000 retail locations. We have 12 types of fish and about 100 branded products. So you can find these in basically anywhere that sells fish. And this is the first widely available biotech animal in the world. It's also the most visible consumer biotech animal, consumer biotech product, in the world. And so from a regulatory perspective, it was certainly very new, but fell under a regulatory framework that was developed way back in 1984. We're still under this framework now. It's called the Coordinated Framework for Biotechnology, first proposed in 1984, implemented in 1986, and it sets forth the basic policy for biotechnology regulation. Development, introduction, anything that's a biotech product falls under this. And so things have changed a lot since then in terms of the technology, but we're still under that basic framework, so it's been very adaptable and versatile. In our case, the FDA is the lead agency. They coordinate with USDA and Fish and Wildlife Service, and the reason for that is the FDA considers essentially the gene that goes in our fish, it's a little fluorescence gene, to be an animal drug. An animal drug is defined as something that changes the structure or function of an animal, and they consider a transgene to be an animal drug. So under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, the FDA has jurisdiction over drugs and animal drugs, and ultimately biotech animals. So it's very interesting in terms of the legal case there. The review process is managed by the Center for Veterinary Medicine, science-based and event-specific. So every line of fish goes through its own review process. The red tetra or green zebrafish, whatever it may be, every line is reviewed independently. And this includes environmental safety, human health, and even fish health considerations. We also have parallel state level processes. So there's federal, but there's a review process in Florida, there's a review process in California, and of course every jurisdiction internationally has its own process. And here are our fish. So I know they're beautiful. I know you all want them. No problem. You can get them in PetSmart. And there's not only the fish, but all of our branded products. There we are in Petco, in case Petco is closer than PetSmart, whatever. Ryan specifically told me I can make a pitch for the fish here, so I just want here's Walmart. That was what they call kind of like a drive alley special. So that promotion, that little kiosk there, in theory, about a third of Americans passed by that. So a lot of people have this idea that biotechnology is like they don't even have a really good idea of where it is or where it's been implemented or how it is. And about a third of America passed right by that. And of course, there are the fish. And so what's interesting is biotechnology can sound really scary to people. Turns out that what people really want to know about GloFish is that they're born with their color, as we say, born brilliant, right? That they're not injected, dyed, or painted. There are actually fish out there in the aquarium fish trade that are injected, and people don't like that. And it turns out that 50% of all freshwater fish owners would be more likely or much more likely to buy GloFish if they knew that they were not dyed or injected or otherwise harmed. And so indirectly, it turns out that they would rather that they are modified genetically than that they're dyed or colored this way with inks. They want to know that they have the same care as other fish. And it's also coincidentally, people like that they go great with GloFish lights and decor. So, and there's our character, our new mascot, Gloria. So, and if you think, well, maybe that's just because the aquarium fish industry is a little bit different. This is a snapshot of our Facebook page, but there's also David Blaine with Kelly and Michael. Kelly and Michael, Live with Kelly and Michael, is the #1 rated daytime television show in America, and he was in a tank filled with 700 GloFish for about an hour on the show. And not only were there no complaints about GloFish, people really liked the beautiful, brilliant, fluorescent fish. So it turns out that acceptance levels can be very high when we focus on the product and don't focus on the process. And in terms of trends, biotech trends, there's a lot of kind of anti-biotech sentiment out there. It's really, from my perspective, it's driven by, in a lot of cases, it's driven by unfounded fears, and it's often exploited by corporate economic interests. And this is unlikely to change anytime soon. The good news is that the public is increasingly making a distinction between different types of biotech products. They distinguish between one product and another, just like they are in our case. Acceptance for certain types of products will continue to grow, and consumer-friendly products and the younger generation will lead the way towards greater acceptance. It's interesting when we talk about biotech, people can become frightened of almost anything. There's a great case of dihydrogen monoxide. So dihydrogen monoxide is a major component of acid rain. It's found in cancer cells, and it's the leading cause of death for children under the age of 5. So scary that a city in California, Aliso Viejo, found out that foam cups were made using dihydrogen monoxide. They decided they better ban this, the foam cups. And they got within a few minutes of actually banning this until somebody realized dihydrogen monoxide is 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, H2O, water. So, kind of crazy. But point being, you can scare anybody with anything, even as benign as water. But people are starting to pick up on this, and times are changing, and the opportunities are incredible. So, people voting for the first time in this year's presidential election won't remember a time that they couldn't go and buy a biotech animal in their local pet store. Why does this matter? So, outside of GloFish, why is this important? This is really important, and the reason that I said earlier, I think it will change our lives more than any other technology, is recently discovered gene editing tools allow us to make very specific changes in DNA. So now we can go in and we can rewrite DNA. So every copy of our cells has a full copy of our DNA, and that has our genes, and genes make proteins, and proteins kind of give our bodies structure and substance and function. And up until basically a few years ago, it was really hard to change this sort of thing. Well, now we can go in and edit, and we can make a single change, a single letter. DNA essentially has has sequences of letters, essentially. We can go in and change one letter as out of 3.2 billion if we want. It can be that precise. And for that reason, this is, I think, the most powerful technology that we've ever encountered, because that one letter change can decide if you get Huntington's disease or not, can decide if you get cystic fibrosis or not. It can decide if you get cancer or not. It can help decide if you can fight off AIDS or not. It is really the substance of our lives that we're talking about here, the fabric of life itself. So potential applications, medical, just mentioned a few of them, even things that are in the news right now. Zika. I was reading this morning that Zika is expected to affect up to 2.1 billion people. Well, we can go and modify mosquitoes to where they won't carry Zika, or we can modify mosquitoes to where they won't be a threat. And that's just one example. That would affect 2.1 billion people potentially. Even malaria. While I've been talking here, statistically, about 10 people, primarily children, have died from malaria. We can stop that right now. Today, we could modify mosquitoes to where they'd be resistant to the malaria parasite and would not pass it on to the people that they bite, and we would not have these children dying. That's 10 statistically who have died and about 4,000 who have become sick, just while I've been talking. And so we can stop these things right now. Not to mention accelerating basic research. In the agriculture space, we need to be able to feed something like 9 or 10 billion people in another few years. When there's not enough food and there's not enough resources, we start to have a lot of conflict. So we need to increase our food security. So we can make plants and animals that are more drought resistant, disease resistant, and pest resistant. And also have decreased environmental impact. So if we can make crops more drought resistant, we don't have to plant as many acres. If we can make animals disease resistant, we don't need as many. So this has a lower ecological impact. And it also helps in terms of animal medicine and animal welfare. So there are things we can do to make animals more resistant to certain diseases and certain other things that increase dramatically animal welfare. On the industrial side, biofuels, you've heard about that, it's been in the news lately. PMP, plant-made pharmaceutical. So instead of the very expensive processes we have now, we can make pharmaceutical products with plants. We can make industrial products, that's a plant-made industrial product, and we can make vaccines in plants, and we can even make them in animals. So there's a great example of an animal where in the goat's milk, they're able to produce a clotting factor that otherwise would be incredibly expensive and incredibly limited and rare. And now this just comes in the goat's milk, real easy, and now people can get it and they can afford it, and it's life-changing. So moving forward, I talked about the coordinated framework from 1984. The technology available today would have been bad science fiction like as recently as 10 years ago. As recently as 10 years ago, if you made a movie incorporating what we can do today, what our company can do today. We're a small company. I'm not talking about the big pharmaceutical companies or the big biotech companies. What we can do, what college students can do at every major university, including this university. If you incorporated that in science fiction 10 years ago, it would have been bad science fiction, and scientists at the time would have said, this is ridiculous, there's no way you can do that. That's how fast the technology is moving. So the regulatory framework from now 30 years ago is obviously being challenged to keep up with this. What's making it even more challenging is that there's no broad public consensus around the ethics of using the technology. It is not a question of what we can do, it's a question of the ethics, and precautionary principle versus unfettered innovation really, from my perspective, gets down to ethics and values and how do you see the world and should we take a chance on this or that and for what reason. This has created really entrenched positions that are contributing to a very complicated and uncertain regulatory environment that has really slowed innovation. And that's not to put a value on that. For some people, slowing innovation is a good thing because they're more precautionary, as Adam mentioned. In other cases, people want to see that innovation. And so the other point that I would really stress is that there's an inherent assumption that only the active use of biotechnology has ethical implications. It's very important that we consider that the lack of use of biotechnology has ethical considerations. We are making a choice. We are deciding as a global society that it is preferable that 500,000 children, primarily again, 500,000 will die from malaria in the next year, and tens of millions of people, I think the number is 200 million, will become infected from malaria, we are making a choice that that is better than modifying the mosquitoes and releasing them so they no longer pass on the malaria parasite. If Zika hits the United States in the type of epidemic that is being suggested, that will be another choice. My suspicion is that if it were to get here, we would choose in the United States to use biotechnology to solve the problem. When it hits the third world, what we've generally seen is we choose not to solve the problem. That is my perception. In any case, moving forward, I suggest that we have a much more holistic debate that looks at the ethical framework and tries to consider these ethical choices that we're making. And I think that would be very helpful in building a consensus across diverse stakeholders and then reaching some clarity on the regulations, which then allow companies to innovate within those regulations. So thank you very much.
All right, there we go. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start and tell you a little bit about our company. First of all, I think this event is fantastic. Not too often that you're on a panel as a technologist and entrepreneur with researchers, and we're on the front lines of innovation, and you all are on the front lines in a different way. And I think this is a really important conversation, and there should be more of this. So, very happy to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about Re3D. We're very proudly an Austin-based company. We were founded in 2013, and we had we're a Kickstarted company, and we had a pretty successful campaign in 2013, launched at South by Southwest. So we're a great local success story. But what's interesting about us and relevant to the regulatory policy discussion is really the versatility of our technology. So the opportunity in the market that we saw back in 2013 is that 3D printing is very much so a disruptive technology, but at the time, most of the printers that are out there were making toys and trinkets, right? Like little bobbleheads and keychains and little novelty things like that. But really, we thought there are real world applications for this. And the truth is that 3D printing has been around for decades. But really as a manufacturing technique and $1 million and up machines. And we thought, well, hey, why don't we apply some of the principles to the consumer machines and build an affordable industrial machine? And so that's our product in the middle there, the Gigabot. It's an 8 cubic foot printer, and it can fill up that entire space. And I've thrown up some pictures just so you get a sense for the versatility of the end uses. Upper left there is a robot. It's called Savioki, and it's a room service robot that delivers room service meals in a hotel. They use the 3D printer, they use the Gigabot to print the actual form factor. To the right of that, those are bronze dinosaurs. And the artist used the Gigabot to print the mold that they then used to pour the bronze inside, an application we didn't even conceive of, when we built the machine and designed it. Below that is an architectural model, it makes sense, prototyping. Directly to the right of the printer there with the orange, that is prototyping for automotive components and engines. Above that to the upper right is a piece of furniture affixed to some wood. That's a real life piece of furniture. Below that is a bicycle. Certainly you can imagine the safety concerns there. We've used bamboo, which is actually a really robust material. Then you have a airplane spinner, and we really liked that application because it was taking the industrial applications a step further. Most of our customers do use the technology for prototyping, but that's an actual airplane spinner in use. And finally, lower right, prosthetics, which we'll talk about in a minute. So there's you get a sense for how versatile our technology is, and I wanted to highlight 3 specific areas here. And Adam was absolutely spot on in his matrix when he was outlining the issues that we face in 3D printing. It's really safety and intellectual property. So product liability. A great case study is prosthetics. To me, this is one of the most exciting and relatable uses, because 3D printing is really suited for highly customizable products and short-run batches. So if you imagine the ability to form fit a prosthetic at a fraction of the cost, you can 3D scan the body part that you're trying to replace and print it. And there's a lot of kind of bionic person superpower type of design that you can apply to it, make kids especially really excited about having a prosthetic, and that's super customized to them and makes them feel like a superhero. But yeah, talk about product liability. It's a quagmire. And really I think this highlights some of the complexity in a lot of these technologies. And I'm talking about 3D printing, but a lot of these principles and issues are really relatable to a lot of the kind of hardware and advanced robotic technologies, like drones, like driverless cars, flying cars. And really, what all these technologies have in common is the intersection of hardware and software. Specific to prosthetics, it's a very complicated value chain, actually, because at the very early stage, you have us. We're producing the 3D printer itself. Well, what are you going to print the prosthetic with? There's the material company, the person that, or the company that makes the plastic filament that will then become the prosthetic. So you have the components for production. Well, somebody has to design the prosthetic file that will then be printed. So you have the designer. Once you have the design, you have to print it. So the person who's the technician running the printer, their hands are in this. The person who scans the body part to be, fully customized. And finally, the person that is the user. So when you look at liability, if there is an injury or an accident, it's complicated, right? User regulation. The gun debate, right? That's the kind of quintessential issue you think about with 3D printing, and it's a pain point, right? It's a thorn in our sides, and it's great to have the opportunity to be on a soapbox for it. You probably won't be surprised that we're not in favor of background checks for guns, right? So when you think about the potential to institute that type of regulation, I think you have to look at it from a bunch of different angles. One, you can create a gun out of wood, pipe, and rubber bands, right? And just having one means of production that, yes, is faster, but you could create a gun with basically anything. And so in my opinion, is undue burden on one particular type of technology. Like, would you ask somebody that owns a CNC machine or other garage power tools to have to go through a background check? And not only it's not just the background check process, but it's the burden on the company to do that. It's time and money. Not to mention, even if that the background checks were in place, somebody, I own a 3D printer. Okay, you've regulated that person, but a lot of times 3D printers exist in what we call maker spaces, right? Like you have Tech Shop up north, which is a great resource for accessing a lot of this technology. So what if someone makes the gun at a shared space like that? Is that Tech Shop maker space held liable? I think the more that we try to institute specific regulations, I don't know that they're that effective. And finally, intellectual property. I mentioned the design, the file designer in the value chain, and there are, in fact, some intellectual property issues that arise in terms of the digital ownership of those files. And this is not unlike digital music and the circulation and distribution of that. So I did touch on this a little bit. I think some of the challenges specific to regulating 3D printing as a whole is really in, kind of what I was trying to highlight in that first slide. There's so many applications for 3D printing. And, I think to kind of approach it from a proactive, more cautionary regulatory approach would be it's unrealistic to try to anticipate all the end uses. We talked about the multiple players involved in the value chain, and we already hit on the background checks. So when we think about kind of this broader debate of product liability, I really think it boils down to buyer beware and seller beware, right? We have taken it upon ourselves as a company to really ensure suitability for our customers. So if somebody comes to us and has an idea for an application for the printer, it's in our best interest. The invisible hand, it's in our best interest to make sure that our customers are safe and satisfied. So we ask them, well, what are you going to do with your printer? And we try to gauge their technical knowledge. But also as the buyer, I think it's appropriate and very reasonable for the actual customer to take ownership of their end use and to make sure that they're capable, that they test the product. A lot of times we'll offer to print a sample of their end use to make sure that it works for them and they can conduct their own testing. And as we're navigating a lot of these issues, this isn't specific to 3D printing. I think it's important to kind of look at first principles, and this is more of probably a philosophical stance. But we have laws in place to protect life, liberty, and property. Right? Your personal safety, protection of your property, and protection of information. And so, I'm a big believer in the justice system being in place to determine blame and award damages and navigate the all the nuances for the specific cases that arrive. So I am very much in the, what's the title of your book? Permissionless innovation. Yeah. Surprise, surprise. An entrepreneur, we're risk takers. We like to be at the front lines, pushing the envelope. But I think that the efficacy of additional regulations is often unclear and can create an undue burden on new companies. One model that I think is particularly effective is private certification. So if any of you are familiar with UL certification, this is a private company that conducts testing and validation and ultimately certification for electrical devices. So 3D printing certainly falls in there. And I like this because the option is it's the manufacturer's option. So we can choose if we want to bear the cost of certification. It can vary from 10, 20, 30, whatever. It ultimately depends on the type of product you have. For brand new baby companies, that might be prohibitive, but at some point, if you get feedback from customers that customers are demanding it, then it will make sense for the manufacturer to adopt these standards. And again, I like that it's not required by law, but it gives customers assurance at the manufacturer's discretion. So with that, I will pass the mic to Nicholson.
Thank you. So I don't have a fancy slide. So we'll leave that up there. Thank you for retweeting. Sorry, what was that? Is there something else I should do? Okay. So I want to talk about something a little bit different, and I'm also coming from a different viewpoint. So I'm not an entrepreneur. I do things that are only vaguely relevant to the real world, but I try to figure out stuff that might potentially be relevant. So I'm a law professor, and so I think about innovation in the life sciences. And in particular, what I've been thinking about a lot these days is the use of really complex, opaque algorithms in medicine. So the scenario that I think will be happening in the not too distant future is something like this. You go into your doctor's office and your doctor says, I'm sorry to tell you this, I have some bad news. You are at a slightly increased risk of stroke, but to try to decrease that risk, we'd like you to take a small dose of an antidepressant every day, and that'll decrease your risk. At least we think so. We don't have any idea why we think you're at an increased risk, and we don't know why we think the drug will help. But we've got great computer algorithms that say that it will, and we're going to trust them. And so this is black box medicine. The idea that we can help make machines can help us make medical decisions by using kind of big data in health and can improve the way we do medicine, but in a way that's non-opaque or non-transparent and is opaque and that we don't really understand. And so the question is, how, if at all, do we regulate medicine where we don't, and in fact where we can't know how it works? So I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about a little bit more about what black box medicine is and why it might be a good thing, and then I'll turn to the regulatory side of things, and I'll try a little bit on the fly, we'll see how this goes, to fit it into the framework that Adam's been talking about and laid out. Okay, so why do we want this kind of stuff? Well, the answer is pretty simple, actually, and it's this. Biology is complicated, like really, really wildly complicated. Human bodies are full of just immense numbers of networks of proteins and cells and genes and gene expression and RNA, and everything interacts in this tremendously complicated fashion, and that's just when you're going around living. When you add in things like aging and diseases and infectious pathogens and what you eat and what you do every day, it gets wildly complicated. The challenge is, the way that we do medicine and the way that we demonstrate that medical techniques work and that we develop them is almost laughably simple. We try to understand stuff explicitly, and don't get me wrong, it's awesome. I spent lots of years in a lab trying to figure this stuff out. I have tremendous respect for biomedical scientists, but the process of slowly making incremental steps in how we understand the way bodies work and the way medical technology works on that is incredibly slow. And the way we try to validate that for use is clinical trials, where you basically take a bunch of people and you separate them into two groups and you give half of them the treatment and half of them you don't give the treatment, and you see if, on average, the half that got the treatment got better. That's great for telling you that it works on average, but it's really bad about telling you why it does or doesn't work for individual people. And it turns out a lot of things work really differently for different people. So one answer to this essential conundrum is to say, well, eventually we'll get there, and decades or hundreds of years from now, we will have figured it all out, and let's wait until then. Unsurprisingly, I think this is not kind of the way to go. And what looks to be a shortcut now is to say, well, hey, we've got so much data. We have so much data about health. Electronic health records, genomic sequencing, metabolite screens, all this stuff that's giving us data about how people are, Fitbits, that kind of stuff, Google searches, all this information about your health. And we're increasingly getting really powerful machine learning algorithms that can find patterns in data without even knowing what they're looking for. So the example I like to use, and I used frequently, is Google Images. You can search Google Images for a duck, and it will show you lots of pictures of ducks. That's not because it knows what a duck looks like or because it has some set of rules for this is a duck. It's because that machine learning technique has been trained and has seen millions of pictures of ducks and billions of pictures of things that aren't ducks. And so it knows what a duck looks like by experience, in the same way that human doctors can say, oh, that's cancer. You know, don't know why, can't tell you the rule, but I know it when I see it, and that's cancer. So we're getting there. And I want to be clear, by the way, this is starting to happen. It's not happening yet, but it's coming. And so the question is, well, how do we regulate it? And so first I want to say what kind of FDA is doing in this space right now and what it looks like they're thinking about. And then I want to talk about whether or not that seems like it's good or there are problems. So right now, well, I'll give it away. I'm a little concerned because I think FDA is leaning towards saying this is like all the other stuff that we see. And FDA is big on saying, prove to me that this works and why this works in a very rigorous, pretty slow, pretty expensive fashion before I'm going to let it on the market. And so I think the most relevant story, and again, this is somewhat on the horizon, so FDA hasn't explicitly said this is how we're going to deal with black box medicine, but the closest story is that of laboratory developed tests. So starting about 30 years ago or so, FDA got the authority to regulate diagnostic tests. These are the kind of things that say, oh, you've got strep throat. And what they said was, if you want to sell a kit to test somebody for strep throat, well, then we want to approve that. And if it's something really new, we want clinical trials. And if it's something that's like something that we've already said is okay, we just want you to show us that it's like that other thing. But they said, there are a bunch of tests that people do kind of in their own hospital or in their own lab, and they develop it themselves and they run it themselves, and they say these laboratory developed tests, or LDTs, we're not going to worry about those so much. Those are the kind of thing that you can innovate freely on, and we're going to exercise enforcement discretion. We're not going to come after you for that. And as a result, unsurprisingly, we got tons and tons and tons of LDTs, many, many more than we got these diagnostic kits. Well, the summer before last, FDA said, this isn't really working for us anymore. We're concerned that LDTs are getting too complicated and that people are doing too much complicated stuff in these laboratory developed tests. So instead, we're going to fold them back into everything else. And we want to go through the same sort of risk-based review where we want clinical trials or demonstrating that it's just like something else that's already on the market. And in particular, one of the things they said that really caught my eye was for tests that involve non-transparent algorithms and make diagnoses, we think that's going to fit into the highest category of risk. And that's the kind of stuff where we're going to want a full set of clinical trials before we're willing to approve it. So that to me sounds a lot like new, flexible, black box medical algorithms. And so what I'm really concerned that what the agency is doing is going to say, this is the kind of stuff where we want you to prove how it works, we want you to run clinical trials before we get there. I'm concerned that has the potential to really stop this technology in its tracks. All right, so that's one side of things. That's what I think is going on now. Well, let's turn to the flip side and say, well, do I buy Adam's point? Do I say we should go permissionless in this and just Wild West it out and see what happens? And maybe based on my phrasing, you won't be tremendously surprised to say that I don't think that's quite the right answer anyway. So health is one of those areas. I think I saw one on that chart for safety, because safety is the real concern. And the challenge with health goods on the market is that health goods are what we call credence goods, which means if you get sick and you take a drug and you get better, you don't really know if the drug made you better or if you would have gotten better anyway. And that's the case with a lot of health treatments. It's really hard for us as consumers and even for doctors to evaluate whether or not a particular treatment actually works or it just happened to coincide with the fact that we got better at that point in time. And so it's tough for doctors and insurers and patients and frankly the government to know whether or not a treatment is a high quality, good treatment. And that's why we have this whole FDA pre-approval regime in the first place, to say we need to develop that information. We need to develop that information in some sort of systematic fashion. So what do we find as a middle ground here? Do we really think that we need one or the other of these approaches? And so innovators frequently will tell you, wow, what FDA is doing is a disaster for this type of innovation. So the story that really comes up is the case of 23andMe, which is kind of when you get the clash of this, the Silicon Valley, Austin, Boston tech entrepreneur culture interacting with the DC FDA. And so 23andMe was a genetic testing company, and what they had was you would sign up for their service, they'd send you a little plastic tube, you'd spit in the tube, and then you'd send it back and they'd do some genetic tests and say, hey, you probably don't like broccoli, but you are at a slightly higher risk for cancer, and here's some other stuff about you. And they totally ignored FDA, like really kind of, in a sense that's funny for me on the outside, but probably not funny for them on the inside, just wildly ignored FDA. FDA sent them all these letters, and they're like, whatever, not worried about it. And FDA came down on them super hard with a hammer and basically shut down a big chunk of their business because they said, you're offering a diagnostic service. We get to say if you can do that. And you never asked us, and no, No, you can't. At least not without lots more information. The funny thing here, by the way, and some of you might have been thinking, well, FDA regulates medical devices. Are these algorithms really medical devices at all? Then the answer is the definition of what counts as a medical device is just insanely broad. Well, no value judgment. It's very, very broad. So in particular, in the 23andMe case, the reason that FDA said, here's the hook, was that little plastic tube that they sent out. Well, they said, that's a sample collection device. So that's our hook. We're regulating you because you've got that sample collection device that you sent out. So that's a physical thing to collect a sample. Similarly, FDA almost certainly, although they've decided not to exercise it right now, almost certainly has the authority to regulate any iPhone that has a health app on it, because it's a physical device that actually collects health data and can potentially make health information available to you. So the authority is really, really broad. After Silicon Valley kind of freaked out about that, they said we're not going to, but it's there, at least potentially. So, all right, entrepreneurs are really worried about this, but they're still getting into the space. FDA is unclear about what it should do, so what should it do? Well, short answer is I don't know. I wish I knew. If one of you knows, please tell me. I would like that a lot. But my thought is that what we should probably do is move towards a more flexible hybrid regime where there is some form of pre-market, maybe certification. I'm thinking more in the procedural side of things, which is to say, yes, you seem like you have the kind of credentials and the kind of ability that we look for in actually developing these algorithms. That, of course, raises all sorts of challenges about who's allowed on the market, who gets to play. But something about, yeah, you're doing a decent job doing it, but if you try to say, does this algorithm work every time and show me the clinical trials before you let it on the market, nothing's going to get on the market. So I think we need some sort of relatively light pre-existing certification, maybe FDA, maybe third parties, maybe an underwriter's laboratory type of thing, and then really robust post-market surveillance, where we say not only are we going to use this to help direct care, but we're constantly going to collect information about how it works, how well does it work, do people actually get better, and do we have information about whether this is a high-quality product or whether it's something that's really flawed. And you don't need to look hard for reasons that we want to be kind of careful about this. There was a fascinating study out maybe 6 months ago in, I think, BMJ, the British Medical Journal, now it's just BMJ, that looked at insulin pumps and insulin monitoring devices for diabetics and found just tons and tons and tons of error in what should be a relatively simple, relatively explicit algorithm to talk about insulin dosing. So hugely crucial thing, shouldn't be wildly complicated, should be pretty explicit, tons of error anyway. So if we talk about a situation here where we're starting to really dive into the complexity of medicine and we don't actually know what's going on, we need to think, I think, pretty carefully about how we ensure that those systems are actually robust and actually high quality so that we really drive the field forward rather than getting mired in lots and lots of problems along the way. So with that, I will stop. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions later.
Oops. It's just not starting from the.
I'm so sorry if I broke it.
No, it's fine. It's fine. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me today. I will be speaking about a research program that I've been working on for about 2 years now. I'm an economist by training, and I've also trained for the past 3 years to look at risk assessment to analyze risk-based regulations. The research program that I've been working on for the past 2 years is on process objectivity of public policy. Specifically today, I will be applying this concept to the peer-to-peer economy regulations, specifically the regulation of the transportation economy. And looking into the philosophy of science, I found two concepts of objectivity. What is objectivity in science was my question. And the very first one that came up was product objectivity. Under this definition, science is objective when its products, theories, laws, experimental results, and observations constitute an accurate representation of the external world. The second concept of objectivity that I found is process objectivity. Science is objective to the extent that the processes and methods that characterize it neither depend on contingent social and ethical values, nor on the individual bias of a scientist. Well, what does that really mean? Let me explain first the easier of the two concepts to explain. Product objectivity. So what's an example of a product objectivity? Let's look at this picture closely. Almost all of the science that brought about most of these products that we see, the dumbbell, the chair, the shoes, the prosthetic legs, that's basically a product, and therefore the science that went into making it happen is a product objective. Okay? I also argue that if we are looking at the effect, for instance, smoking on incidence of lung disease, lung cancer, that's also a product. And the science that we do to analyze this issue is product objective. Well, why? Well, because we're defining a risk here to be incidence of lung cancer. Therefore, that's the product, and we look at those numbers. Now, the second concept, process objectivity, is a little more complicated. It's the one that we don't experience every day. And I decided to explain it by bringing insights from theoretical physics, and a very famous theoretical physicist for that matter, Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was asked to conduct an analysis of the Challenger disaster. He was asked to explain or help explain why did the mission fail? Why did the Challenger not come back home safely? And for Feynman, he found that there is a violation of the objectivity of the process by NASA, and that's what caused the Challenger disaster. More specifically, I want to crystallize the idea by explaining the avionics system. The avionics system, and that's an explanation from Feynman, is basically everything that, for instance, a pilot looks at, all of these computers. And the avionics system takes care of the mission from the time it takes off until it comes back home safely. So in order for us to understand the avionics and all of these variables that interact with the spaceship, and some of them we don't even know because it's a venture to space, we set up 4 computers. And all 4 computers receive the exact same input. They're reading the same inputs and they're processing the same inputs. Why do we need 4 computers? Well, because we don't know the outcome. And when we don't know the outcome, we use process objectivity. So all 4 computers are necessary. And we stop them at a certain time. And we look at their output. Do they all agree? Because they're all following the same exact process. Mathematical logic, and many lines of codes, the exact same lines of codes. So when we stop them and look at all 4, and one of the computers don't agree, we have to eliminate it from our sample space. And we have to only let 3 computers run. Why? Well, because the computer that we eliminate is likely not to be following the process correctly. Because the likelihood that all 3 computers violated the process in the exact same ways that they agreed is very minuscule. And therefore, we eliminate the computer that doesn't agree and we let them run. Then we stop them one more time and we look at the output. They agree, continue. If they don't agree, we have to eliminate the source of disagreement, and therefore The source of the disagreement is eliminated, and now we have only two computers. But unfortunately, at that moment, we have no way of adjudicating between the two. Which computer is following the process correctly, we don't know. And therefore, we have to abort the mission. That's process objectivity. We set up the redundancy not to figure out which computer is giving the wrong answer, but to figure out which computer is most likely not to be violating the process, because we don't know what the correct answer is. That's procedural objectivity, because we cannot look and see the input. That's in contrast to product objectivity, when we have a product in mind, like the prosthetic leg, and we zoom in our process to achieve that product. We know what it is. How is that concept from theoretical physics going to translate into economics analysis of public policy and regulations? For theoretical physics, when there is a violation of the process, the spaceship explodes and we can look at it. And we can look at this incidence and learn from it. In public policy, most of what we're doing is a counterfactual. And most of the time, economists and public policy analysts are looking at the dark. We're staring at the dark, at the counterfactual. But that means that the fact that we have to follow a process is even more important, because we don't know what the outcome is. So we have to set standards, procedural objectivity, that we follow consistently and transparently. So in hope that when we do that more and more, we are zooming in on the truth. So what is this procedural objectivity of public policy? What is that process? Well, we have to always start out somewhere. Yes, we don't know the outcome, but we have to start out with a method by which we can accomplish the outcome. The first one is regulatory best practices. This is the stock of knowledge that we have right now on how to approach a particular issue. Now, they're not best because somebody said they're best, it's because this is our stock of knowledge as we have it right now. But as long as new evidence and our stock of knowledge is increasing with time, and we have competition of idea that points to one practice that may be not appropriate in a particular instance versus maybe a practice that's not appropriate at all, and we update our stock of knowledge, that allows us to do retrospective review, look back and update our knowledge, and that feeds into what we now constitute the new best practices. So the best practices improve over time and become better and better. Now let's transition into new technologies. New technologies, whether it is Uber, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's driverless cars, or even pizza boxes that are being dropped at our doorsteps from the sky, literally, all of these new technologies create risks just like anything else. They have uncertainty associated with them, and these uncertainties create concerns, especially from the regulators. But the question remains, is our stock of regulations appropriate to apply it to these regulations? We don't know the outcome, so we have to follow a procedure. So let me zoom in on one particular regulation. Taxi cab regulations. And I'm going to zoom in further to Austin. Taxi cab regulations, by the way, have been with us for over 100 years. But in 1984, the FTC has written a document that outlined the procedure by which these types of regulations can be justified. And the procedure is basically to outline the set of market failures that would likely occur if the market was left to on its own with free entry and exit and competition in the taxi cab industry. Market failures such as inefficiently high rate, lower quality, asymmetry of information that might drive rates higher and quality lower, among other things. The FTC at that time did not find ground for these regulations. There was just simply not sufficient evidence that the counterfactual, free entry and an exit, free competition, would lead to all of these problems dramatically enough to justify the regulation. But nevertheless, that was the process. And local and state governments, many of them, adhere to that process. In other words, this is our projected list of market failures, and we need to interfere. But that was before Uber and Lyft entered the market. That was before the creation of this parallel market. Uber and Lyft made the counterfactual factual. So the question now, is this now appropriate? Does our stock of knowledge right now say that our old regulations that are applied to the taxi cab industry appropriate for Uber and Lyft, these technologies that we don't understand quite yet? Now, when I looked at the taxi cab regulations in Austin, I noticed that there has been violation of process even in this controlled environment. So, the taxi cab regulation in Austin said that we need to control the entry into the industry. So we're only going to allow, let's say, 2 or 3 companies to operate. Okay? But we have to be careful because we want to allow for competition within this limited market. So not a single one of those companies will gain beyond a certain point of a market share. That point is actually 60%. But even with that, there was a violation of the process. For instance, Yellow Cab has 68% of the market share. Okay? But still, there is something fundamentally deeper here. And the fundamentally deeper thing is the parallel market, the counterfactual that became a factual. We need not to jump in from old regulation to applying the same regulations to Uber and Lyft, because if I was a regulator, I would use that parallel market to see if the process by which I justify taxi cab regulations is still in place. Do all of the market failures still exist? Uber offers the data from Uber and Lyft and the other companies that will come through. All of these, the companies are providing great data points for us that we can study. Is the price, in fact, higher? Is the quality lower? Is there safety concerns as we have thought? Do all of these market failures still exist? That's what we need to look at right now. I would like to leave you with a great quote from Richard Feynman. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. And I think this can be rephrased and applied to public policy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dima. You can give me the mic. That'd be great. Thank you so much. Well, that was wonderful. Those are a wonderful set of presentations by everyone. And I'm going to just ask maybe a few questions before opening it up to the audience in the time we have remaining here today. Let me begin with something Dima mentioned about regulatory best practices and reconsidering existing regulations and regulatory regimes as new disruptive technologies come along and allow us to reconsider past paradigms or approaches to issues, and see if I can then incorporate all the other remarks from our other speakers, because there was a lot of consistency in what they had to say. I heard everything from the need for a more flexible or hybrid regime to the idea of maybe alternative dispute resolution mechanisms or certification mechanisms, the idea of maybe taking a different look at ethics and values in a new framework and considering risk trade-offs, or what's called sometimes risk analysis. I like the way you framed it as sort of active versus passive kind of consideration. And let me do this and then also ask us to consider maybe what these alternative approaches might look like, or these hybrid regimes, or these new ways of thinking about things. And to do so, I thought it might be interesting to just read you something from, I don't know how many of you know Wendell Wallach. He's one of America's leading bioethicists. He's at Yale. And I'm debating him on May 3rd at the Microsoft Innovation Center because he's got a new book out called A Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. And Wendell is very, very concerned about all the technologies we're discussing here today, but specifically, he talks about biotechnology, data-driven medical innovation, 3D printing and robotics. It's really quite interesting because he's particularly concerned about those and their impact, not just on sort of culture and economy, but really on humanity and the future of our species, in fact. But after hearing Wendell sort of go on for many chapters with these concerns about all these technologies we're talking about here today, he actually gets to a point where he ends up sounding a little bit like I sound when I talk about potential recommendations as needing to be more sort of maybe bottom-up, flexible, different, maybe hybrid approaches. And he says his preferred model of governance going forward for all these technologies are what he calls governance coordinating committees, which would coordinate the separate initiatives by various government agencies, advocacy groups, representative industry, and these GCCs, these governance coordinating committees, would serve as issue managers for the comprehensive oversight of different fields of research and technological development. And they would be led by, quote, accomplished elders. And I laugh because it sounds like the wise old man sitting around like, what should we do about 3D printing and biotech? But let's take it let's take it at face value. Led by accomplished elders who have already achieved wide respect, are meant to work together with all the interested stakeholders to monitor technological developments and formulate solutions to perceived problems, preemptively in character. Rather than overlap or function as a regulatory body, however, the committee would work together with existing institutions, including regulatory ones. What are the other things he has in mind when he talks about these things? He talks about, and I talk about these in my book, codes of conduct, statements of principles, partnership programs, voluntary programs and standards, certification programs, and private industry initiatives. What in the world of the so-called philosophy of technology, you can group all of this together as sort of soft law or soft governance mechanisms, as opposed to sort of hard-nosed like law, like thou shalt not, or mother may I kind of approach. So this isn't heavy-handed precautionary principle regulation. This is something different. It's also not perfectly permissionless innovation. It's somewhere in between. It is a hybrid model. But let's talk that through and see like what kind of mechanism works. And let's maybe use the examples that we've heard today. 3D printing. I've got a paper coming out about 3D printed prosthetics for the University of Minnesota Law Review. And I sort of talk about sort of all the different types of ways one might go about regulating that and challenge like the assumption that it's easy to like get at those things the way you would traditionally regulate it because there aren't deep-pocketed middlemen or intermediaries. It's you can't go after the materials, it's plastics, right? I mean, you can't really go after the devices or the device makers because it's general purpose technology. So it's really hard to know where, as you suggested in your presentation, like where do you affix liability or damages or whatever else. Data-driven innovation and biotechnology. Well, there we do have larger intermediaries. We have very big ones, and in the case of 23andMe, the FDA came in and hit them hard. But increasingly, a lot of this data-driven innovation in the field of medicine or health research, as well as biotechnology, is very much bottom-up. It's people even sometimes experimenting with their own bodies. The so-called biohacking movement, people just doing things to their own bodies in their own homes. And if you ever want to see a freak show, go on to biohack.me and just read the threads about people cutting open their fingers and sticking magnets in and putting cellular antennae in the back of their skulls. And they're doing it together without any big-heeled intermediary doing it. No one's making money, much like 3D printed prosthetics. It's voluntary, bottom-up, open source. Very hard to know whether we're talking about traditional regulatory models or something like what Wallet talks about here of coordinating committees. What are these sort of pressure points? Who are the gatekeepers? Who's responsible? Just to let you know where I come out on this, I'm not opposed to these sorts of ideas, and I talk about them favorably in my book, but I question whether they can work in such a world of highly decentralized innovation. And what I say is we ought to be plowing a ton more societal resources, including regulatory resources, into risk education and to talking to the public about the serious risk trade-offs they face when they take matters into their own hands, or to innovators when they create products with sort of what they feel is boundless potential. We should be asking them like, okay, have you considered the other side of that, what the downsides might be, and can you bake in a little bit of safety or privacy or security by design, as the phrase goes. So I've thrown out a lot there. I'll just open that up and ask the panel to consider like, what are our alternative governance models if the old playbook doesn't work? Let's go on down.
Well, since we were talking about 3D printing, and that's great that that's a subject of interest for you, I'll just describe how we're approaching prosthetics. It's scary, right? And we're very careful to not brand ourselves around that right now. And I like the committee approach. I like the collaboration approach. We don't have in-house experts in prosthetics testing. And so we've started partnering with a organization that tests prosthetics. And it's rigorous. Just to flesh it out a bit, we have to pass two tests, and this is for lower limb. When you're dealing with lower limb, it has to be weight bearing, and that's why you don't see a ton of prosthetics for legs. There's a couple nonprofits out there. We work with one that does arms because it's one thing to pick up a water bottle, it's another for a kid to hang off of it. Monkey bars, right? And so the two tests that we have to undergo to be kind of blessed by this one tester is it has to withstand 1,200 pounds of weight. And the second is a repetitive motion test where we have to simulate like the knee bending for it's like 1,000,000 cycles, or basically just for a month straight. And so we're working with them. We're maybe we feel like 75% there, which is a great accomplishment. But we're still working, and we're not trying to commercialize until we do get kind of their seal of approval. And so in my mind, that's finding someone that is kind of an industry expert and partnering in that way, so that we're not going at it alone. But what's to stop someone out there from making a leg prosthetic on the gigabot that they already own? So I think that's kind of where the system breaks down a bit. But again, you can't anticipate every single use, and you could do a lot of like dumb things with just about any technology. So,
Alan?
So, great question. I start with where do the regulations originate? Why do we have them? And I think there's often this idea of the regulators and the regulations in this vacuum. In my experience on this, my perception is that the regulations are derived from legislation. The legislation is a function of what our legislators enact, which is really indirectly a function of the will of the people. When we talk about public policy, I think we have to consider it's the public that ultimately drives this policy. And I think in looking at the regulations and how we can change them, I know from my perspective, it certainly gives a tremendous amount of comfort to people that the FDA reviews our fish, that the FDA looks at ecological impact, looks at human health impact, and fish welfare questions. So I think while we in the technology side have an enormous level of comfort with the technology and understanding, I think we have to realize that there's a broader public. For the technology to be accepted and embraced, the public needs to feel comfortable with that. Now, it's not just the regulators, it's the companies. We have to deal with industry. Industry has to feel comfortable with this. Consumers have to feel comfortable with this. Our employees have to feel comfortable with what we're doing. And so there are a lot of stakeholders. And I think the question that I would ask is, what is in order to have innovation and move, progress in a positive way, where is that balance where people feel comfortable that the technology is safe and that it's appropriate for its intended use, while the bar is not so high that we can't get it onto the market from a business side? So that gets to the hybrid approach, and the question is, where is the balance? And I think the balance is ultimately has to be in a different place for different technologies. It's the same reason why a police officer won't stop and arrest everyone who's driving 56 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour zone when there's a school shooting going on down the road, or there's a house on fire 2 blocks up the street. And in our case specifically, with respect to GloFish, the FDA does use something called enforcement discretion. The FDA has the ability to regulate our product just like a pharmaceutical drug. They choose not to because they realize that the risk is very low. So we do have enforcement discretion. I think ultimately the public would be well served by using a lighter hand on regulation when it's appropriate, But just today, the company that has the mosquitoes that will very effectively address Zika was trying to get them deployed in the Florida Keys, and 10,000 people came out in opposition. 10,000 people, the epidemic's not that big, it's not problematic yet, but you can imagine if 10,000 people came out opposed, 2 people were there to support, that's not going to move forward because the public is expressing at some level of concern. If in a few years there's a big epidemic and 1 million people come out in favor of it and those same 10,000 people are opposed, that's going to move forward real fast. So I think we have to take public perception into account, and risk education is a very important part of that.
Nicholson, as I bring you into this to talk more about what you specifically would like to see in terms of a hybrid regime, let me just bridge what you had to say as well as the things that Alan had to say about that approach and the enforcement discretion at the FDA, because it seems to me what's happening at the FDA is that there's a new model evolving with the way they exercise that sort of enforcement discretion in the form of sort of informal guidance. And Nicholson mentioned, like, you know, is this a smartphone or a mobile medical device? And the FDA has an ongoing effort asking that exact question. And they've brought in people and they've investigated because they know the sheer number of apps that are flying into app stores that are health and fitness related are just overwhelming. And even if you got a certification process in place for all the sort of running or fitness apps, by the time you got it done, there'd be an update. And you'd be like, well, is that one certified? And you could go into every type of potential medical or health or data-driven type of innovation and suggest that that same thing's probably happening. Is that the world we're going to live in? Is the new hybrid world one of highly informal governance with maybe, as you said, I think, robust post-market surveillance?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There are 2 different issues that I think you're raising in your question. One of them actually ties really nicely into what Dima was talking about, which is kind of the process of regulation, which is to say that FDA in particular has moved far away from, so you think about agencies as like setting rules, and FDA almost never sets rules anymore. Occasionally they set rules, but what they do instead is they issue guidances, which are to say, hey industry, here's kind of what we're thinking, but you probably shouldn't rely on this, and you can also do other stuff. But in reality, they treat it like a rule, but it's just a guidance. And in fact, now they often don't even do guidances, they just do draft guidances, which is to say, here's an informal discussion draft for the informal way that we're thinking about thinking, and we'll finalize it sometime, and sometimes those float around for a couple decades, and never get finalized, and sometimes get withdrawn. So it's a really interesting governance model. And there are reasons for it, which is that they're trying to be more flexible and working with industry and being kind of softer touch in some ways.
So is that law?
Well, it's certainly soft law.
Right.
It's really tough for
But is it
predictability.
enforceable? Is an informal guideline or recommendation enforceable in court? Like, we really want you to do this with that algorithm, please?
Right. So
is that law?
So it seems like it's probably not enforceable in court. The interesting thing about FDA is FDA never goes to court. Companies don't go to
nobody wants to face
court
that.
with FDA either,
Right.
because it's such a huge agency with so much power that FDA will send you a letter to say, here's a warning letter, we think you should stop doing this. They don't ever go farther than that. Not never, but almost never. Because almost no company in the market will get an FDA warning letter and then keep doing what they were doing before and wait for a court challenge. They just stop, because FDA is the big, big gorilla. So when they set policies and say, this is how we want it, it happens, and it's really interesting the process by which that happens, and it makes it very hard to challenge. On the other hand, I think FDA is, I think they're good people, I think they're trying hard to do great stuff, and I think oftentimes they get it very, very right. But it's really tough to figure out the governance model. So in terms of your specific answer with kind of what a hybrid regime might look like in sort of medical algorithms, this land, I think a function of regulatory agencies which is underserved now and which isn't viewed as part of their core mission now is an information sharing function. So I think there are a lot of industries, in particular this happens all the time in medical devices, where there's a lot of opacity about companies not really saying what exactly they're doing. Trade secrecy is a big part of this. If you want to try to protect your IP, keeping things secret is a way to do it. But if what we need is kind of simultaneous real-time oversight and evaluation from a bunch of different parties, whether that be academics testing out algorithms, or doctors, or insurers, or hospitals, or people, or kind of prospecting certification folks, you need the information to be out there. And so I could imagine that if we want a really flexible regime of evaluation from a bunch of different angles, you could see a really key role for FDA or somebody else in coordinating the sharing of information to make all this happen.
This is wonderful, and this is a great transition to bring Dima back into it, because what's actually happening, the way I've tried to describe it in my work, is sort of the rise of multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder processes where basically the government is serving as a coordinator of people who are in the world of technological development doing something interesting, and they bring all the relevant stakeholders together and they try to hammer out best practices or codes of conduct with these folks. And this has been done now by multiple agencies, not just the FDA, but also the FAA. The Federal Trade Commission has several of these. The NTIA, National Telecommunications Information Association. We now have best practices, codes of conduct, or industry guidances like this for drones, driverless cars, big data, biometrics, and facial recognition. There's another one coming on something I'm forgetting. There was an online advertising and an online advertising for kids multi-stakeholder process. I've got like a dozen of these listed in the book. But bringing Dima back in, because Dima, you were talking about regulatory best practices and process. And one of the things we do together at the Mercatus Center at George Mason is we do regulatory impact analysis and cost benefit and try to consider, like, was the process followed? Is it right? And are you know, because there's actually a strict process for how an agency is supposed to formulate a rule and then issue it, and then people consider it and file and comments and everything. But now we're in a totally different, these hybrid models, you know, what's a legitimate process now? It's not just a legal question, there's an economic one too, like how do you factor in? And also there's the complication of some of the variables we're talking about. These ethical ones, like what is this, what's the impact on our humanity? What's the impact on our privacy, right? Well, sometimes these are eye of the beholder kind of things, right? Some of us might be sort of wild-eyed transhumanists who think like, I should be able to do anything I want with my body. Other people say, no, they should never do those kind of things, you know, that's immoral. And privacy can be like, oh, I'm an exhibitionist. Look at me. I'm all over Facebook and everything. Other people are like, no, don't take any of my information, right? I am really challenged when I do a cost-benefit analysis these days on how to factor these things in. So any general thoughts on that and how we might do it better?
Okay, so here's the hybrid model that I would be proposing. Is remember the 4 computers? We needed the 4 computers because competition matters when we don't know the outcome. So we need competition in the risk assessment, whether it comes from the academic world, from a research center. We need to have multiple entities assessing the risk. Now, assessing the risk according to what guidelines, right? That's the question. So I think to work within the system that we have right now, we have to follow the strict procedure that you were talking about earlier. Because the regulatory agencies have a strict procedure to conduct risk assessment, which later on factors into how would you assess the benefit, how we translate the risk into lives or years added to life. And that's basically the cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day. But if we, from academia, from research center, we start following the procedure that the regulatory agency set to itself, and by doing that, we have an outcome that may or may not differ from the regulatory decision. But if it does differ, and I think that the judicial system offers an outlet for enforcing these practices, for upholding these practices. The agencies have information quality guidelines by the Information Quality Act. So if you request through a petition that the agency accepts your evidence by its own IQA guidelines, which is done according to its own procedure, then I see that that's a one possible outlet, because the agency now is facing a choice. Do I refuse the petition? But why would I refuse the petition? It's been done according to my own guidelines, to my own procedure. Then the court could interfere then and say, well, it's your own procedure. And there is evidence that maybe not following the procedure has led to a net cost rather than net benefit.
But if the court was judging this according to the books and saying, well, you have this process, but the process that we've just discussed is becoming so informal, what is the court to do? Are they, what if the FDA hammers out a rough agreement on the bioengineering of animals that updates, Alan, what's the name of it again? The coordinated framework?
Yeah.
But it's not a formal document. It's just a rough guidance, or they do this for mobile medical devices. They kind of already have.
So just
If the court, if that's before a court, what
case in
happens?
point, when our fish first hit the market, the FDA guidance that we're under was not out. Our
Okay.
fish hit the market years before the guidance, and an activist group sued FDA in federal court saying that FDA was not taking enforcement, even though FDA had made statements, not guidance, not draft guidance, but FDA had made statements that they would regulate, and they've sued and said FDA is not regulating. And the court said, well, this is actually a function of agency discretion. The agency can do what the agency thinks is appropriate. So stuff happens all the time in the informal
Right.
world, and it is complicated.
Yeah.
And in our case, the public was not in an uproar, and the public generally felt okay about it, and that made a big difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead.
Follow up. I'm just wondering. So I find the idea of process objectivity to be fascinating and useful, but all the technologies we're talking about here seem fast, and the process that you're and fairly flexible and mutable. And the process you're talking about seems like what I really want is a couple of things that are very rigid, and that go on in parallel. And then if there's a challenge between them, then we're going to involve the court system, which seems pretty rigid and pretty slow. So I find the idea really attractive, but I'm curious about the kind of implementation. Is there a way to do this fast, or is this just saying, or is this a different way of saying here is a procedural thing that just means we're going to put on the brakes and things shouldn't move that fast?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, when it comes to these technologies that are moving very fast, I do recognize that this idea that I'm proposing is going to move slower. Now, ideally, especially when it comes to these technologies with vast uncertainties, I would leave it to the common law to adjudicate after the fact. In other words, once harm is in place, the case comes to court, and then we have the common law to adjudicate between parties and allocate damages. That is ideally what I would envision for these technologies. Now, if that's the case, that's great. But if it's not the case, then I propose this as the second alternative, that if you do want to be preemptive, then this is the way to be preemptive about it.
If we have questions, I'd welcome them. Okay, good, because let's go in the back here. We have two. Are we going to use a microphone, or? It might be easier.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. This has been great. My question might be for Dima, because it might hit your issue wheelhouse as it relates to ride sharing, but it might be for you as well, Alan. But given that the regulation that y'all are talking about does take place within the context of the political process, how do you protect the hybrid model that you mentioned from the tendency of the political process to sometimes be influenced by highly motivated, organized interests?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. And the process is through competition. I would say my answer is competition. If you have multiple entities that are not involved within the political process challenging the process. In other words, I do recognize, and in a paper that it's up on my website called On Objective Risk, and I outline that issue. That all of the challenges that have been done through for risk assessment, they either come from special interests within the industry or from within the regulatory agencies, and both entities have a certain bias, whether the regulatory agency bias towards protecting the regulation and promoting more regulation, and the industry depending on their incentive scheme, whether to promote the regulation or to ask the agency not to regulate. So the science that they're presenting is influenced depending on their interest. That's why I stress the idea of competition from an independent source outside both entities, taking it to competition between academics, research centers that follow the procedure correctly, and multiple entities following the same procedure, whatever it is the agreed upon procedure, and see what the outcome is, and actually present that to the agency or through the judicial process to see if there has been a violation of the process, one, and two, whether the violation of the process leads to net harm. Because I think, as Alan was pointing out, we are making a choice. It's not a choice between expending resources and saving people. It's between saving these people and saving these people. So we need to be clear about what the choice is.
Yeah, so just a quick comment. In our case, to agree with what you were saying, we independently put together a scientific advisory board to assess our application. And in fact, I called people who were known to be leaders in the risk assessment field who had raised concerns around the technology. And I said, tell me what could be a problem with our fish and how we can best approach that and address that. And they assessed our fish and they said, actually, your fish are fine. And we were able to present that to the regulatory agency. And that helped a lot with the regulatory agency. It helped a lot with the media and ultimately the public. And I think to answer your question, it is very challenging. There are very highly motivated individuals, what we think of as small but vocal groups of people, a fraction of a % of the population who have economic interests or very strongly ideological interests who will work very hard to stop what someone is doing in certain cases. And I think the answer really is to develop a multiple stakeholder approach as best you can, to go to third-party academics, to go to the media, try and sort of put the information out there in a way that the public can sort of weigh in on it. And I think in the end, if the public is okay with the application, then the application will move forward. It will be real interesting. On May 7th, we're going to have a little vote here in Austin around Uber and Lyft. The sense I have, not knowing really much about this space, is that it will pass and Uber and Lyft will continue on the way they want. And I think fundamentally, getting to multiple stakeholders is the best way to do this. I also think that the bigger the change, the more risky sounding the change, the more stakeholders, the more evidence, the more public reassurance is necessary. But kind of getting the public engaged, I think, is the best thing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I agree with Dima and Alan on that, because I've actually done some work on the history of regulatory capture of independent agencies, and one of the things I've recommended is that we consider reconstituting technological agencies every once in a while, sort of new body, new laws, because if they get too entrenched and too ensconced in the past, they end up often being captured by incumbent industries and doing their bidding because there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between them. You think about the long, lamentable history of how the Federal Communications Commission's protected broadcast interests, and every new media operator that came along was somehow thwarted for a while to protect broadcasters. The same could be said for more modern technologies. There's a concern right now that commercial drones can't develop because the Pilots Association are clamoring with the FAA, don't allow it because we're concerned about it. And that's always been their constituency. But if you reconstituted regulatory bodies, you occasionally maybe sunset them and brought a different body in, or use something like what Wendell Wallach suggests, like a governance coordinated committee that sort of, meets as a 5-year term or something, and then maybe goes away, and then a new body comes along, that maybe helps stop that problem, and a different form of competition develops in sort of the oversight role. There was a question back there in the back. Okay, sir, right next to you, Ryan.
I'd like to know, if you do get this hybrid process going, how do you go back and try to get it Uber and Lyft to implement that process? Because I think they would have an advantage. Anyone who's already didn't have to go through the process, set up shop and everything else, is in the market, and then you have new people trying to get in. Now they have to, go through the process. Things have been slowed down. It seems a bit unfair.
This is a great question, and to just elaborate on it, the question is, if we did a hybrid model and you had the multi-stakeholder process, all the relevant parties today, what about that innovator who's sitting there 10 years from now, comes up with the next great 3D printing innovation, the next great biotech innovation, the next great, are they bound by it? Or are they going to be restricted by it? Or are they unlimited by, how do we work that out? I think, is that getting to the heart of your question? Okay. Anybody on that?
Well, I just want to pile in one more question. So assuming that we do come to consensus that this committee should be formed, who selects who's on the committee?
Yeah, that's right. That's sort of like, how do you get the consent of the governed, if you will, right? It's like, this is a new kind of governing body, but who the hell elected you, right? That's the question. It's kind of unclear.
Yeah.
So my take, just to be clear, is that we're probably best off practically, from my perspective, working with the system we have and realizing that we can call academics to have them look at products independent of agencies. We can engage with the media. We can engage with the public. We can work with regulators to within the system to have different levels of regulation. I think maybe from an industry perspective, being more aware of the types of things we can do within the system would be helpful. And to the extent that a company like Uber or Lyft, when that path is blazed, that's the path. That's the de facto path for other companies. My perspective is, and everyone has, certainly their own background and perspective on this, is maybe for industry to shift more to try to work with the system we have, and incrementally work over time. And technologies that were heavily regulated 50 years ago are not regulated right now. So as entrepreneurs and as businesses, it's very hard to really push for wholesale changes in a system that we work with. And practically, I don't know if there's precedent for that actually happening. And so all these ideas we're talking about, I guess to the extent we can work with them now, I think it's probably a good path forward.
So I'll speak to that maybe in a slightly different way, which is to say, so my other area of interest, I do a bunch on this kind of regulatory stuff, but the other area is in IP, where part of the point of intellectual property is we don't know what technology is coming. And so we try to design IP systems that are technology agnostic. That doesn't always work, but at least the idea is the patent system is the same for small molecule drugs and biologics and medical devices and staples, because we don't know what the next thing is going to be. And so we try to design an incentive system that's relatively agnostic as between different technology systems. Now, it doesn't work, but we try. I mean, it works some. And so you could imagine trying to say, when we're developing this hybrid model system, we want to try to build in that sort of technology agnosticism and that sort of flexibility to say, we don't know what the algorithms are going to look like 10 years down the road, and we don't know how much 3D printing is going to change and the limitations of what you can and can't print. I mean, there are machines that are being developed now to 3D print drugs. And so we want to try, at least ideally when we're constituting these regimes, to have them be flexible enough to move forward and respond to new technologies, rather than kind of trying to lock us into the system that we have now. And that, I think, is kind of what I'm arguing with FDA about. Not that they're listening to me, but or that I'm frankly talking to them directly anyway. But if there's a model that says, oh man, this is the way to approve penicillin, it's just awesome for penicillin, that might not work very well for drugs that are roughly 10,000 times the size of penicillin, and are much harder to make. And so trying to figure out how to make these regulatory systems flexible so that the systems themselves can persist, because you're right, it's really hard to get a new system. So you try to make the system be more flexible, more reactive going forward, which I think is an advantage of hybrid systems, at least potentially. Not that it's easy, but I think that's a design consideration we try to take into account from day one.
Dima, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to remind you of the loop, the process objective loop of public policy. So a big input is we have the current stock of knowledge, the best practices, but they're not best, they're best right now. Until new knowledge comes into play, just like the knowledge that maybe the way we the regulated or pass the penicillin drug doesn't apply to something else. And then we have to do the retrospective review. This is a very important step, the looking back step. And we have to institute a process, a retrospective process in place, because that's how the stock of knowledge improve. That's how the best is best, because it updates constantly. So that's just what I want to.
That's great. I wish we could talk about this more. This generally applicable sort of principles is, I think, we all agree. We need flexibility. It needs to be adaptive. But from everything I've heard you guys say, all of you say today, it's not happening, right? I mean, Alan began with the 84 framework, and then we're hearing about the FDA's and flexibility and other things. It's great in theory. In practice, it's hard to find good examples of how that's played out the way we all wish it would.
Yeah, I just real quick clarification is there is a big effort underway now to update the coordinated framework. Now they're not going to change it. We're still going to be under the coordinated framework, but there's a big push to what they call modernize it, which will be interesting And I am very confident that public input will sway that very significantly. So feel free to go and comment on that if you like.
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more, sir?
Thank you. So my question, I guess, is more about a couple steps down in terms of legal consequence, limits of liability and indemnification. Okay. So I'm going to pick on GloFish just because you have an existent product and you're out there. So if you imagine the worst risk case scenario, incredibly small probability, very high consequence, and it transpires. Because you have FDA approval, do you feel that that there are limits to your liability, or do you have to fully indemnify anybody that's impacted by the catastrophic?
First, there actually isn't anything. We're talking about small minnows, essentially, that sadly enough, if they get outside in the wild, they'll die. But sure. But I think that may be more of a legal question. We do have general liability insurance. I would anticipate that if somebody, let's say somebody saw our fish and they were traumatized by how beautiful they are, it could happen. It could happen. If that were to happen and they were to sue us, I don't think that FDA review would protect us. Maybe you could comment on the legal piece of this. We're also so I would expect that we would be liable potentially, or at least someone could assert a claim against us, I guess.
I can make up the scenario that would represent that. I don't know if there's value in that. But in terms of a framework, if the parties can bring forward the low probability, high consequence scenario, and then you might be forced to get that bonded, that set some dollar amount, the worst case scenario impact is imagined, and then you have to seek bonding for that.
Yeah.
And the insurance company says it's low probability, sure. At a reasonable rate, we will indemnify you against.
Yeah, I think the challenge that's been raised with that is that from people who think about worst case scenarios is that sometimes let's talk about other products. Maybe the worst case scenario is so bad that no company could withstand that type of claim, and no insurance company could, for that matter. I mean, we saw in the financial market meltdown, the biggest, strongest companies in the world were just fell over almost like dominoes. So I think that would be the objection raised. Conceptually, I think it's been pointed out that we probably have these structures in place to allow for under common law for people to assert all kinds of claims and let these things be adjudicated. Would any attorney?
I have one other thing I want to add to this because this is a huge deal, especially as it pertains to things like 3D printing and robotics, or the so-called maker movement. This question of liability looms large. It also looms large, obviously, for advanced medical and other types of technologies. I've written a lengthy analysis of sort of like liability norms within the maker movement, and specifically suggested we might need to consider some sort of immunization of intermediaries like 3D printing platforms or stores or like robotics makers as makers of general purpose technologies from onerous forms of liability, so that their sort of life-saving inventions can actually get on the market, like driverless cars or things like that. And we have models for this in American law. For example, in 1986, we passed something called the National Childhood Immunization Act, which was basically to ensure that vaccine makers didn't stop making child-saving, life-saving vaccines because they were being sued if there was even like one child that was getting sick. So we created actually a compensation fund to say if a child does get sick, we'll take money out of that to pay for that sick child, but all the others are going to get healthier because the vaccines exist. So we incentivize that. Likewise, in the internet world, we have something called Section 230, which basically immunizes online platforms to allow them to carry speech freely, like on Facebook and on Yelp and on eBay. You can communicate freely and leave critical reviews and do all sorts of things, and the intermediary itself cannot be sued by law. If you want to go after somebody, you have to go after the end user as opposed to the technological intermediary. So what I suggested in my piece is we may need to broaden that for some other technologies. But in some cases, for things like biotech or advanced medical, that's a lot harder, because there you probably would want to say we want to continue to have a certain amount of liability if there's a real serious product defect or someone gets really sick. But what about driverless cars? Every day in America, 100 people die and 6,500 people are injured because of human error behind the wheel. I have to believe driverless cars are going to bring that way down. But at the first sign of an accident, somebody's going to come in and sue the living hell out of those guys. Are they gonna continue to make that technology if they're getting sued at every juncture?
I really like what you said about risk education.
Yeah.
That's very important, that the user of any technology has to have, there's some marginal level of risk understanding.
Yeah.
Should be allowed to be presumed.
Yeah.
So they undertook its use.
Did you hear about the 3D printed retainer case that just happened?
Retainer?
Kid at Dartmouth, I believe, 3D printed his own Invisalign.
Oh, Invisalign.
Yeah. And he did it, I don't know, $40
Yeah.
all total versus, I don't know, $4,000 for an Invisalign. Everybody was clamoring like, tell us how to do it. Tell us. He's like, no way am I
Yeah.
telling you how to do this. I'll get sued. But it was a proof of concept that even young kids can make medical devices. Now, what are we going to do about young kids making medical devices, right? That's a potential problem. He started making when he was in high school. And he did it, and in college he finally was done with it, and he showed his teeth before and after. It worked marvelously. We need to educate them like, hey, just because you can, maybe doesn't mean you should, right? It could be real dangerous. Somebody in the story about this in the Washington Post said, well, if he could have LASIK'd his own eyes, would that have been a good idea? Probably not.
Well, I also think you raised kind of a broader point about moral hazard, and you pointed out, if a regulatory agency blesses this, then I think people feel empowered to kind of stretch the limits even more. And I think everyone has to take responsibility, do their own testing with the technology. And just because there's a regulation, and maybe that's more of an argument that the regulations can actually in some ways do more harm because they kind of have a false sense of protection, right? I think it's, on the buyer side and the producer side, we're taking the steps to try to do the appropriate testing and, take a more data-driven approach.
Wonderful. Is that good to wrap it up right there, Ryan? I mean, we've had a lot of
Good last words. This was a great discussion today. Thanks to all of our panelists. We want through these forums to be able to identify areas that the center can get involved in supporting, some possible research avenues. I know I have a few ideas. If you have something you want to share with me afterwards, please do. But right now, just please join me in thanking this great group of panelists today.